Thanks so much, Heidi. Hi, everyone. I'm Dominique Green. I'm currently a postdoc at the University of St. Andrews, working as a data analyst on an antibacterial resistance in East Africa project. So when I was invited to talk about my PhD, I was really excited. I don't really get a chance to talk about intersectionality a bit with my postdoc. So I was really excited to do this presentation. So I'm going to jump right in it. This is a part of my PhD where I'll probably give you in this talk probably like about 50% of my PhD in a super condensed version. So the overarching aim of my PhD was to explore any insights that conceptualizing social exclusion as multidimensional disadvantage in the United States had on our understanding of the processes of disadvantage. So for this presentation, I have 3 research questions. What is or are the factors of social exclusion in the United States? From an intersectional perspective, to what extent are socio-demographic characteristics associated with multidimensional disadvantage? And then this question I put as a bonus for this presentation. I was quite interested in looking at if there were regional differences in multidimensional disadvantage for different groups of women. And we'll get to that at the very end. So in order to shed light on multi-dimensional disadvantage and address some of the criticisms of the US measure, I conceptualized disadvantage as social exclusion. As a concept, it's been studied in Europe, but not extensively in the US. Social exclusion is recognized as the involuntary exclusion of individuals and groups from political, economic, and social processes, preventing their full participation in the society in which they live. Now, poverty in its traditional notion is one of the many causes of social exclusion, but it recognizes that there are many other causes, and as such, it's a multidimensional concept. This multidimensional characterization of social exclusion considers the various ways in which disadvantage operates to circumscribe the opportunities and life chances of individuals and groups in society. It implies that a person can be excluded from housing, from employment, from education, transportation, low standard of living. And it also means that a person can be deprived of many different things at the same time. It recognizes the intersection of disadvantage from various spheres of life. And through this lens, this notion of exclusion links together both social rights and material deprivations. So it encompasses not only the lack of access to goods and services, which underlines the traditional notions of poverty, but also exclusion from social security, from participation, and from representation. So to operationalize social exclusion, I use the Bristol Social Exclusion Matrix, or the B-SEM. It's presented here in this table. It identifies 3 interconnected domains: resources, participation, and quality of life. Now, this taxonomy is not definitive by any means, but it's desirable for me in doing this research is that it was developed with the dynamic nature of social exclusion in mind. The domains are considered relevant to the 4 stages of the life course: childhood, youth, working age, adulthood, and later life. And as a theory-driven framework, the B-SEM was derived without any reference to existing data sets in particular country contexts, which suggests that it can be broadly applied to the analysis of social exclusion in various contexts. Using the B-SEM will allow for an analytic approach that simultaneously considers the meaning and the consequences of multiple categories of disadvantage without separating the economic and the social indicators that can influence and comprise each domain. And by using this framework, I'm attempting to understand how these dimensions depend on one another for meaning and how their joint association is related to the outcome of exclusion. So using these domains, I forego developing an index that combines the multiple indicators or creating a binary variable for excluded and not excluded. So instead, I use factor analysis, and it's really useful for investigating these types of complex concepts that aren't really easy to measure by collapsing a bunch of different variables into a few interpretable factors. And by using the factor analysis, I was able to get a series of continuous measures that can be used to answer other research questions. So typically, poverty studies in the United States have focused attention on the effects of poverty across social categories that can be generally defined by either race, gender, or age. This focus on singular categories does make us aware that women and minorities are often much more at risk to poverty. And indeed, US Census Bureau report on income and poverty acknowledged that on the year that I looked at it, 2015, acknowledged that more than 24% of Black Americans are below the official poverty line compared to 9% of non-Hispanic white Americans. Women also have higher instances of poverty than men, but examining poverty via these analytical categories offers descriptive value, but often leaves the discussion of those in poverty as an issue mostly experienced by women and minorities. And framing discussions in this way is a part of the ampersand problem. And the issue with the ampersand and the studies that use it is that it neglects a missing piece of the intersection between multiple social identities, and consequently how that intersection might influence an individual's experience of multidimensional disadvantage. And here is where Crenshaw comes in. She produced not only a critique of the invisibility of Black women at the intersection of gender and race and ethnicity, but also the critique of identity politics, because it tended to overstabilize discrete groups and categories. Crenshaw argued that although the shift of focus from individuals to groups is important, identity politics had to take into account that individuals are situated into multiple groups. Gender is too often simply used to mean white women, while race too often meant Black men. And an intersectional perspective examines how identities are related to each other and in their own experiences, and how the social structures of race, class, gender, sexuality, age, and ability intersect for everyone. As a result, identity groups aren't homogeneous, and individuals are affected by intersecting structures of injustice. And the concept of intersectionality identifies a mode of analysis that's integral not only to women, gender, and sexuality studies, but also to the social sciences in general. Within intersectional frameworks, race, class, gender, sexuality, and other aspects of identity are considered mutually constitutive, meaning that people experience these multiple aspects of their identity simultaneously, and the meanings of different aspects of identity are shaped by one another. They don't exist separately. Adopting this a framework allowed me to avoid contributing to this ampersand problem and lets me grasp how social identities such as race and sex, which I focused on, intersect at the micro level and to reflect the multiple interconnected systems of disadvantage that was under analysis in my study. And though there are many intersecting identities that one can analyze, such as the intersection between age and sex and class, etc., for my PhD, I focused exclusively on the intersection between race and sex. I follow this because not only am I a Black American, but also because it's the intersection that Crenshaw focused herself when she first articulated intersectionality, and because the experiences and the challenges faced by Black women are often left out of the literature. So for my PhD, I know it might seem a bit dated now, but I used the 2015 American Community Survey, the public use microdata sample files, which are produced by the United States Census Bureau. The ACS is the largest survey in the United States with a population sample of more than 3 million addresses each year, including households and group quarters. It does give detailed demographic, social, economic, and housing data, and it's the only suitable source of small area data on social and economic characteristics. The microsample files are data products derived from the full ACS. It enables data users like myself to create their own estimates on various characteristics across geographic areas. In lieu of using the entire microdata sample, I did delete sample members who were younger than 18 and those who live in group quarters. I didn't have complete information for all indicators for those groups. And I recognize that due to this, some of my work might be missing key demographics who may be most severely impacted by exclusionary processes, such as the homeless, the institutionalized, and children who are often least likely to be counted. But I recognize that this is a consequence of using secondary data, even if it comes from the government. Once I've deleted those sample members, the resulting sample was over 2 million. It's quite big, but I did run into quite a few troubles with that. And if those of you who attended my first FemQuant seminar back in 2017, you know that I burned one of the uni's hard drives at Edinburgh trying to run my analysis. So I ended up taking a 10% random subsample, and I ended up with about 234,000. But when I still did the analysis using replicative weights on it, the population sample was still over 2 million instead of the 200 million. And the subsample allowed me to continue the analysis without any additional issues. So from the POOMS files from the ACS, I used 15 variables that serve as the indicators for the domains of the B-SEM. And that's in the second column of the table. I'm not expecting you all to read that, but it's just there for information. And as you all can imagine, when we're often limited to the data that's available, particularly when using secondary sources. So I'll point out to the blank indicators, which signify that there were no appropriate variables in the American Community Survey that could represent this domain. For instance, there were no indicators that represent the crime subdomain. The ACS is an objective survey, so it doesn't ask respondents, for example, how they feel about their living conditions, their neighborhood, or income levels. So I'm limited to what's there. And given that there's only 4 blank indicators, using a data set that wasn't designed in such a way to capture social exclusion, I found that there was sufficient enough information to continue with the analysis. So after preparing the analysis, I'll talk briefly about 3 phases of the results to address those research questions. Defining multidimensional disadvantage, testing the association with an intersectional framework, and then briefly looking at some regional differences for women. So for phase 1, I found 3 factors of advantage after running the analysis. And I'm calling them advantages because of the direction of the relationship that these individual variables have with their respective factors that I note on the slide. So 5 variables loaded strongly on factor 1. The items loaded on this factor are disability status, travel time to work, whether the person is an employed civilian, and driving as a means of transportation to work. I see that having a disability has a negative relationship with this factor, as does not in the labor force. Given the variables that load in the direction of the relationship, it suggests that this factor relates to an individual's ability to participate in the labor market, and I refer to this as labor force participation. For me, this was probably the most straightforward factor that came from the analysis. An individual's ability to participate in the labor market is considered a key in their ability to earn a livelihood that's sufficient for the society in which they live. And people can also benefit from increased contact and social networks. There's been a lot of focus in the UK on increasing labor force participation to increase inclusion. My results lend some weight that labor force participation is a key dimension in the United States as well. But unemployment is not the only component of labor force participation, and that also has to be recognized. Transportation and support for the disabled also become important. Let me just check something. Okay, there we go. There you go. Then we have economic security, 6 items loaded on this: health insurance, living in overcrowded housing, total income poverty status, being a recipient of food stamps. And for those of you who don't know, that food stamps are like a type of subsistence given to people on low income, and one's educational attainment. Health insurance, educational attainment, and income all have positive relationships with this factor. When an individual lives in overcrowded housing, is in relative income poverty, and is a recipient of food stamps, there's a negative association with this factor. Due to the relationship, these variables take this factor I called economic security, and I thought about calling this, giving it this name, after I read a paper from the UN. Basically, the paper suggested that economic insecurity rises from the exposure of individuals, communities, and countries to adverse events, and from their inability to cope and recover from these costly consequences of those events. And this twofold understanding of economic insecurity, the exposure to events and their inability to recover from them, is quite in line with the items that loaded on this factor. For instance, living in overcrowded housing, being income poor, and a food stamp recipient relate to this first understanding. Exposure to these types of scenarios indeed influence economic security. And the other variables that loaded on this factor relate to an individual's ability to recover from these adverse events. If a person has health insurance, they're able to protect themselves from the adverse effects of illness and injury. And finally, there were 3 variables that loaded on factor 3, marriage, divorce, and unmarried partners. There's an understanding that marriage provides benefits that's not enjoyed by the married. Marriage, particularly in the US, is suggested as a key to economic well-being and the avoidance of income poverty. Viewing marriage, though, through this limited lens often ignores context and inequality. And while marriage can produce economic benefits, this is mainly based on the assumption that both people in the marriage have earnings. Viewed in another way, the connections between marriage and disadvantage can be linked to notions of social capital. If social capital is captured from the rooted resources in social networks, then a family is an important source of it, and there are positive externalities associated, like social support and leverages. Examining the table, we see that the direction of each of the items within what they take in the third factor. As such, I call this marriage as a social resource, and I examined marriage and its connection to disadvantage as a lack of family-based social capital. So once we have the factors of advantage, which via the factor analysis turns the factors into continuous measures, I wanted to test the association between these derived factors of disadvantage and social demographic characteristics, particularly via intersectionality. I looked at the non-intersectional characteristics in another part of my PhD, and it did lend weight to other arguments that highlight that women in some minorities are less advantaged than their respective reference categories. And to analyze this, I used multiple or less multivariate linear regression models, particularly because my PhD was quite exploratory. To quantify intersectionality, there have been two approaches, an additive one and a multiplicative one. The additive approach is more or less a model that adds the effects of marginalized identities based on the idea that the more marginalized statuses that the individual identified with or was identified as occupying, the greater the oppression. So researchers that advocate for an additive model argue that a person with two or more intersecting identities experiences the distinct forms of oppression associated with each of his or her subordinate identities summed together. The more devalued identities a person has, the more cumulative discrimination he or she faces. So basically, the additive approaches argue that each system of domination has an independent effect on individual statuses, so race hurts, classism hurts, etc. For example, the joint effect of being a woman, belonging to an ethnic minority, and representing disadvantaged social class is seen as a sum of the effects of these three demographic variables. In contrast, a Black man may experience some advantages based on his gender, but has limited access to power based on his race. Empirical research born of this have focused on urging inclusivity of topics and populations previously overlooked, but transformation of research processes came later. But the problem with the additive model is that it doesn't take into account how our shared cultural ideas of gender are racialized and how our ideas of race are gendered, and that these ideas structure access to resources and power, whether it be material, political, or interpersonal. So to incorporate intersectionality, I follow the multiplicative approach. Intersectionality at its core asserts that the influence of a given demographic characteristic on a social outcome is conditional on the intersection of characteristics. In the multiplicative approach, the characteristics that make up the interaction have valid meaning and provide context. And as such, the approach begins with the socio-demographic characteristics under investigation that make up the intersections. And I'm interested in race and sex. So when employing intersectionality quantitatively, it's necessary to include the categories that make up the intersections in the model, as well as the interaction terms. So I'll start first with the main effects. My analysis found that women have on average, less advantage than men in every factor. For the main effects for racial minorities, the analysis shows that only Black minorities and natives are less advantaged in every factor compared to the reference category white. For the other racial categories in analysis, Asian, Pacific Islanders, other races, and mixed races, the results show that they are more advantaged than the reference category in some factors and less so in other categories on average. But we're particularly interested in this intersection of these categories, and the OLS regressions yielded some interesting results. So when I decided to explore intersectionality, I first looked at means testing prior to completing the regression models. Using the means for women across racial categories, I was able to hypothesize the direction of the means for each factor of disadvantage that I looked at for minority women compared to white women. And you can see those in the blue arrows. Now, means are helpful, but they don't tell you whether or not there's a statistically significant difference between the categories. So here is where I did the OLS regressions with the race and sex interactions. So firstly, I found that there were some similar patterns in the directions found by just examining the means of each group. The lighter blue arrows represent the tested significance of the average differences between the different categories, and our reference category were white women. There are some general patterns. Most minority women, except for Native and Black women, have more average, higher average in the marriage as a social resource factor compared to white women. And nearly all minority women, except for Asian women, are less economically secure than white women. In the labor force participation factor, only Pacific Islander and Native women are less advantaged than white women. And these patterns lend weight to Crenshaw and others about the importance of analyzing multiple intersection identities a women may have, because as we can see, though women in general are less advantaged than men in each of the factors, there's still a lot of differences in how women across racial categories experience disadvantage. So I was really interested in looking at this a bit deeper. So Black women have some of the highest labor force participation rates in the United States, and that's been demonstrated in other studies. And as such, we'd often expect that participating in the labor force would translate into economic security because most people derive their income from work. However, having a higher labor force participation score than white women and Asian women on average, Black women still have lower economic security than white women on average. And I included the information for Asian women because I thought it was an interesting contrast, because for Asian women in the United States, they have a higher labor force participation score than white women. And this does seem to show in the economic security factor. For Black women, however, this isn't the case. So subsequently, it raises a lot of questions as to why this is happening. What's different between Black women and Asian women that for Black women, their work in the labor market isn't translated into additional benefits elsewhere? And it's based on some of the research I've done, it does highlight that there are issues of working poverty, a lack of insurance, which is a component of the economic security factor, and perhaps as well as underdeployment. Perhaps there's a heavy proportion of Black women in the United States market that are what's been called bad jobs, forcing them to work more, and that's not translating into economic security. It's interesting because Crenshaw did use the concept of intersectionality to grasp the ways in which the intersections of gender and race limit Black women's access to the American labor market, and how a lack of this understanding led to the marginalization of Black women and Black women's experiences. The results here show that in the 30 years or so since she articulated intersectionality, women do have access to the labor market, but likely not the type of work that will also improve their situation and other factors. So I decided for this presentation to move the analysis a bit further and look at the experience of disadvantage by region of the United States. So the Census Bureau divides the country into 4 regions: the South, Northeast, West, and Midwest. Though this could definitely be divided a bit further. In my PhD, I explored disadvantage using a multi-level model where individuals were nested in states. And I found that there were between state differences in the experience of disadvantages, particularly in labor force participation, and even more so in economic security. Marriage as a social resource had the least variation, though some outliers for above average was Utah, and outliers for below average was Washington, D.C. But for this presentation, I wanted to focus on the region because I hadn't looked at a region before, and I was quite interested to look at this intersectionally, particularly given the results of the OLS models. So here I show the breakdown by region for labor force participation and economic security. I don't show one for marriage as a social resource because the multi-level models didn't show much variation between states, and there were less differences between regions. Now, for labor force participation, I noted that Black women have on average higher labor force participation scores than white women, and the graph on the left shows that this is largely driven by above average scores in labor force participation in the Northeast and the South. Asian women and white women have below average scores in each region, with Asian women having the lowest scores in the Northeast and white women having the lowest scores in the South. On the left is economic security, and we can see that despite having above average scores in labor force participation in the South and the Northeast, Black women have consistently below average scores in economic security across the regions, with the lowest in the Midwest. Granted, there may be a lower concentration of Black women in the Midwest, but looking at the South, where there is a relatively high concentration of Black women, the scores in economic security is still fairly low, comparatively speaking, particularly when compared to white women who have above average scores in the Northeast and Asian women who have above average scores in the South. Again, this raises questions about where Black women are concentrated in the US and their ability to use their labor force participation to translate into economic security, which in the South and the Northeast, they haven't been able to do on average. So that brings me to the end. So my research has taken a primarily European understanding of disadvantage and applied it to the United States, a context in which social exclusion is under research. Using large-scale survey data, I found that in the United States, there are 3 dimensions of advantage or disadvantage: labor force participation, economic security, and marriage as a social resource. This analysis lends weight to an argument that income is an insufficient measure to address disadvantage in the United States. The results I have here had substantial impact because these measures can be used in subsequent studies to analyze well-being and equality in the US. I've taken the first step with that to understand the association between demographic characteristics via an intersectional framework so that we can see that the experience of disadvantage varies among different groups of women. Adopting an intersectional analysis in my models shows that those independent variables explain 3 times more variation in economic security than it did in the other 2 factors. The intersectional analysis framework adopted here also lends weight to Crenshaw and others that in the first instance, identities are related to each other and that the social structures of race and sex intersect, that those who are experiencing these intersecting identities are affected by intersecting structures of disadvantage. Looking specifically at Black women in the US, I've confirmed other studies that Black women have high scores in labor force participation than women in other racial groups, particularly in the Southern and Northeastern United States. And if it's consistently argued that people receive most of their income from work, we'd expect that some of this would translate into more economic security for Black women, but this hasn't shown to be the case. Compared to white women, Black women have lower advantage scores in the economic security factor. This then suggests that there's a continued need to address issues of working poverty, Black women not having health insurance, and being underemployed. After I did my analysis, I realized that there's important questions that's raised about the complexity of disadvantage. Intersectionality has proven to be a useful tool in this analysis. The focus of my research has been to understand how different measures help us to understand disadvantage and to explore the role that intersectionality plays in understanding how disadvantage is experienced. I've explored the intersection between race and sex, but other intersections could prove useful in explaining more of the variation, such as that between sex and age, particularly in the marriage as a social resource factor. As an approach for understanding the multidimensionality of disadvantage, social exclusion has shown to be quite suited to exploring some of these inequities that arise in looking at the association with sociodemographic characteristics. Thank you.